Welcome to Retro Reads, where timeless mysteries come to life. Today a new case awaits, full of twists, secrets and thrilling revelations. Settle in, relax, and let the adventure begin. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from and at what time. Let's get started and dive into this unforgettable story. If you've never heard Nero Wolfe insult a loaf of bread, let me tell you it's a uniquely civilized form of violence. That morning, I entered the kitchen to the aroma of something Fritz was particularly proud of, a golden-crusted sourdough still crackling from the oven. He stood beside it with the quiet dignity of a man who'd just performed a minor miracle and expected appropriate reverence. Wolfe, seated in the dining room with a napkin arranged like diplomatic credentials across his chest, took one bite and set the crust down with exaggerated care. He said nothing at first. That alone was ominous. Then, "This," Wolfe said, "is pedestrian." Fritz stiffened. I've seen the man baste a roast with serenity during a full-blown argument, but this time his knuckles whitened on the bread knife. "It's the same recipe I've used for 6 years, Mr. Wolfe." "Yes, but something fundamental has altered. The flavor is flat. The texture—" He touched it again as though it had offended him. Despondent. I cleared my throat, which under Wolfe's rules of conduct at breakfast is tantamount to a bar fight. "I think the word you're reaching for is bread." Fritz turned to me, appealing to the voice of reason. "Archie, I haven't changed a thing. The starter was exactly the same. Same feeding schedule, same humidity, same proportions." "Then your starter," Wolfe said, rising slowly, "has betrayed you." That would have been the end of it, except for the look on Fritz's face, not bruised pride, concern, a quiet, unsettled kind of worry that didn't belong in our kitchen. Wolfe saw it too. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just the bread. I'd seen Fritz angry, but never rattled. After Wolfe left for his orchid session, I leaned against the counter while Fritz hovered over the sourdough like it might confess. "It doesn't make sense," he muttered. "I've nurtured that starter like a child. There is something off." "Sure," I said. "Maybe it's got ennui." "This is serious, Archie." Fritz rarely used my name like that, square and direct, no accent lightening it. He wiped his hands, pulled a linen cloth off a glass bowl, and showed me the starter. It looked, as usual, like a bubbly swamp creature in a jar. "I feed it every night at 9. I smell it every morning. Yesterday, the scent was wrong, slightly metallic." "And you think someone tampered with it?" I asked. "I don't know, but I wouldn't have said a word if Mr. Wolfe hadn't noticed." I couldn't help myself. "You mean His Majesty's tongue actually serves the public good?" Fritz ignored that. His hands were trembling slightly as he placed the bowl back. "Someone's been in this kitchen, Archie, I feel it." I didn't say anything, but for the first time I looked at that sourdough the way Wolfe looks at a bad alibi. By noon, Wolfe had returned to the office, restored by the orchids, and calmed, somewhat, by a more agreeable baguette. I was at my desk reviewing expense sheets when the doorbell rang. She came in with that peculiar grace you see in people who've carried bad news for too long. Her name was Mrs. Eloise Hardgrove, and she introduced herself with a firm handshake and a briefcase clutched like a lifeline. "I apologize for the intrusion," she said, taking the red chair opposite Wolfe. "But I was told you have an impeccable palate and a history of solving difficult things." Wolfe's eyes, which tend to show about as much expression as a library statue, narrowed just slightly. "My brother," she continued, "is missing. Graham Hardgrove. He's a baker, perhaps you've heard of him. He runs Hardgrove Artisan Breads on Madison." "I have not," Wolfe said flatly. "He's difficult," she admitted. "Obsessive. He recently accused a rival of stealing one of his signature techniques. There were arguments. And then 3 days ago, he disappeared." Wolfe glanced at me. "And you believe this is a matter for investigation?" "Not officially. The police think he's taken time away, but he left behind his dog, his keys, and his starter." That last word did something. Wolfe's gaze flicked, barely perceptible, toward the kitchen. The starter again, the same word from Fritz's mouth. I didn't know how yet, but things were beginning to rise. That evening, as Fritz served dinner in stubborn silence, he placed a small plate between Wolfe and me. On it, 2 thin slices of bread from the bakery down the street, the crust and crumb. "From the Mettner place," Fritz said. "I tasted it this morning. Something felt familiar." Wolfe bit into it with exaggerated care. His face remained impassive. He chewed slowly, eyes closed. Then finally, he looked at Fritz. "You're correct." Fritz gave a small, triumphant nod, but Wolfe wasn't done. "This is Hardgrove's grain mix. Not a replication, an extraction. Subtle, yes. But I remember the toasted millet. And he never used rye. This has been altered. Borrowed and bent." I leaned forward. "You're saying the rival baker, what was his name? Calvin Mettner, stole the recipe?" "Not merely stole," Wolfe replied. "He has internalized it. That is far more intimate." Fritz murmured something in German I won't translate here, and left for the kitchen. Wolfe leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Goodwin, you will go tomorrow to this crust and crumb and taste their bread." "To taste?" "And speak, and observe, and irritate. Bring me back something more than flour and crusts." I nodded, then paused. "You're taking the case?" He closed his eyes, steepling his fingers. "I am taking offense." That, from Wolfe, was as good as a declaration of war. The crust and crumb sat like it knew it was better than you, gleaming counters, artisanal brickwork, and an air of curated smugness that practically caramelized in the air. I stepped inside with the intention of purchasing a croissant and gathering intelligence, not necessarily in that order. Behind the counter stood Calvin Mettner himself, slicing a cranberry walnut bowl as if it were an enemy of the state. He was tall, angular, with a chef's coat that fit too perfectly and an expression that suggested he'd once been snubbed by a Michelin inspector and never recovered. "Something I can help you with?" he asked, already calculating the odds that I couldn't afford the rye. "Possibly," I said, lifting an eyebrow. "I'm looking for a loaf that tastes like betrayal." He blinked. "Excuse me?" "Bread," I clarified with a smile. "I've been sampling a few bakeries for a friend who's developing a palate profile. Yours came highly recommended." I omitted that the friend in question was currently refusing to consume anything baked in-house. He handed me a slice. "We bake with instinct, nothing pre-measured, everything by touch, by scent, by memory." "Memory?" I echoed. Funny word choice. Mettner didn't flinch, but he didn't smile either. "Why?" "Oh, no reason. Just reminded me of Graham Hardgrove's grain blend. You know him, right?" A flicker. That's all it was. The kind of flicker you'd miss unless you were looking for it. And I was. "He's intense," Mettner said. "Brilliant in his way. But he was never good at sharing." "Then it's a good thing flour doesn't come with copyrights?" I replied, chewing slowly. "Tastes familiar?" "Coincidence," Mettner said flatly. I thanked him, paid for a small baguette, and left. As I stepped out, I jotted a note on my pad: Calvin Mettner, defensive when cornered. Too polished to be casual, possibly guilty of gourmet theft. Also, smug. Behind every successful bakery lies a resentful apprentice. I found one hauling flour sacks in the back alley behind the crust and crumb, muttering things into the air that would have turned yeast sour. "Hard day?" I asked, leaning against the wall like I was born to eavesdrop. He jumped, tall, wiry, too much caffeine in his bloodstream. Name tag read Lila Grange, which, yes, belonged to a guy. Go figure. "You from Health?" he asked. "Worse," I replied. "Customer." He snorted. "That explains the shoes." "I'm interested in Graham Hardgrove," I said casually. "And in who's been borrowing his ideas." His face closed faster than a registered drawer. "I don't know anything about that." "But you've heard something." He hesitated. "Look, Hardgrove was obsessed. He thought everyone was copying him. He said someone was watching his bakery, taking notes. There were nights he'd sit inside in the dark, just watching the street. Did he mention anyone by name? No, he said. But he had a list. I saw him writing names. Metner was on it. So was some food blogger. He burned it in the oven when he got spooked. That raised a brow. Burned the list? Yeah, Lila said. He was always paranoid someone would break in and steal from him. Or worse. Worse than stealing sourdough? Lila looked at me, deadpan. People kill over less. Back at the brownstone, I conducted my next investigation with a pot of coffee and my least favourite assistant, the internet. With some effort, I found it, a sleek, anonymous culinary blog called Proofed and Poached. The most recent post was a detailed description of a fermentation method that matched Hardgrove's exactly. Right down to the signature millet blend. I read it 3 times. The phrasing was too technical for a casual foodie. Whoever wrote it had spent time with Hardgrove's method, either first-hand or with notes that weren't meant to be public. Wolfe was upstairs, so I briefed him via intercom. There's a blog, anonymously written, that walks through Graham's entire process, almost line by line. Indeed. It went live the morning after he disappeared. A pause. That, Wolfe said, is either a memorial or a theft. Could be both, I replied. Continue. I dug into the site's metadata. The domain was registered through a privacy proxy, standard for those who don't want to be found. But the blog also accepted comments, and someone named Baker Eater, 93, had left 2 oddly aggressive ones beneath the post, both accusing the author of plagiarism. I clicked through the profile. Empty. But the IP was partially traceable. The address pointed to a small cafe on 16th Street, 1 block from the Crust and Crumb. Coincidence? Not in my line of work. When Wolfe finally came downstairs, he found me mid-sentence in an email to Saul Panzer. You're involving Saul, he said, eyebrow raised. Someone leaked Graham's process the day he vanished, I said, and someone else accused them of stealing it from him, publicly. Wolfe closed his eyes and spoke as if to no one. The bread was not the motive, the knowledge of the bread was. We were now kneading closer to the centre of the dough. If you want to know what a baker is hiding, don't look in his pantry, look in his garbage. That bit of wisdom wasn't mine, but it came in handy when I found myself strolling the alley behind the old Hardgrove location, which had been shuttered for a week, but still carried the faint scent of scorched flour and sour yeast. A few pigeons flapped away when I lifted the lid on the steel bin beside the door. Inside, charred parchment, 2 broken baking peels, and several chunks of half-burned bread. I pulled one out with my pen and gave it a closer inspection. The crust was hard, blackened, deliberately overbaked. But there was something odd clinging to the edge like a fine grey dust. I tapped it gently onto a notepad. It wasn't ash, not entirely. It had weight. Back at the brownstone, I handed it over to Wolfe, who lifted his eyes only slightly as I approached. Charcoal, he said after one glance. Possibly activated where? Alley behind Hardgrove's place. Looked like someone tried to burn the evidence. Literally. That may have been the intention, Wolfe murmured. Or it may have been the method. Method of what? I do not yet know, he said. Which in Wolfe speak translates to I know exactly what, but I'm not ready to say it out loud. He set the bread down like it had insulted him personally and reached for the bell to summon Fritz. The scent of smoke and secrets was rising. When Wolfe rang for Saul Panzer, it was the verbal equivalent of ordering a scalpel. Saul is what happens when a bulldog earns a diploma and learns how to wear a hat. I want names, Wolfe said simply when Saul arrived. Those connected to Proofed and Poached directly or obliquely. Trace the blog to its origin, quietly. Also, Mr. Metner, connections, finances, legal entanglements, and what he does when he isn't pontificating over ciabatta. Understood, Saul replied. No questions, no smile. He took the crust sample and the scribbled IP address I'd passed him, then vanished as quickly as he'd arrived. I turned to Wolfe. You expect the blog to trace back to Metna? I expect, Wolfe said, that it will trace back to someone desperate enough to share a secret, clever enough to anonymize it, and foolish enough to believe anonymity is permanent. I gave a theatrical sigh. You always take the fun out of a simple breadcrumb trail. Wolfe closed his eyes. There is no such thing as a simple breadcrumb, Mr. Goodwin, only an unseen loaf from which it fell. With Saul on the scent, Wolfe returned to the kitchen, though not for lunch. He requested Fritz prepare a sample using a combination of flours that mimicked the crust and crumb recipe, but with one key ingredient adjusted. Millet, he said, specifically toasted. Let us see what rises. Fritz, who had been nursing his wounded pride with silence and vigorous whisking, said nothing when Wolfe gave the instruction. But the moment I brought in the bag of millet flour from Hardgrove's original supplier, his shoulders straightened like a soldier handed back his rifle. The preparation took a full day. Fritz didn't rush. Wolfe watched the process from a distance, as if supervising an orchestra rehearsal. By the next morning, the loaf was done. Golden, perfectly domed, and audibly crisp as Fritz sliced into it. I took a piece and chewed. It was warm, earthy, and carried a faint sweetness that crept up late. Wolfe didn't speak until he'd swallowed 2 full bites. Then he nodded once, almost imperceptibly. This, he said, is the original. Fritz blinked. Original? Hardgrove's signature, Wolfe said. The blend of red wheat and toasted millet in this proportion, with this crust structure, no amateur could replicate it. It is not reverse engineering, it is mimicry at a molecular level, I offered. Which means the crust and crumb version wasn't a guess, it was a theft. Not merely theft, Wolfe corrected, possession. Whoever baked that bread did so with either access to Hardgrove's handwritten process or his hands. You think someone forced him to bake under duress? I asked. Wolfe didn't answer immediately. Then? No. I think someone studied him, closely. Or perhaps more chilling, someone used him. And then discarded the baker, but kept the recipe. I looked at Fritz, who had gone pale. You think Graham is dead? He asked. Wolfe's silence stretched long enough to serve as an answer, but it wasn't confirmation. Not yet. Just the faint scent of something burnt, lingering in the air. Saul Panzer never rushes. He operates on a tempo somewhere between deliberate and glacial, but the results tend to be more reliable than most birth certificates. 2 days after Wolfe sent him out sniffing for the scent of digital breadcrumbs and dusty flour ledgers, he returned to the brownstone with a small folder and a face that suggested the news would be both useful and unpleasant. Wolfe gestured toward the red chair. Report. 2 pieces, Saul said, flipping the folder open. First, Calvin Metner visited a specialty grain supplier 2 days before the proofed and poached blog post went live. Same supplier Graham Hardgrove used, Exalted Grains, down in the garment district. Wolfe's eyes stayed half-lidded. A supplier known to be proprietary with its client list. Very, Saul nodded. Their sales rep confirmed Hardgrove had an exclusive purchase agreement for their toasted millet blend. Metner showed up, used a fabricated bakery name, and ordered 10 pounds of the exact mix. Did he pay in cash? Number company card. But the company doesn't exist. A ghost transaction, Wolfe murmured. Saul handed me a second sheet. And this is from the blog server logs. The original proofed and poached post was uploaded from a cafe Wi-Fi network. The day before it went live, the same network was accessed by a laptop registered to one Warren Metner, Calvin's cousin, tech background, currently freelancing web development. I whistled low. So Calvin gets the grain, cousin Warren leaks the method, and Graham... What? Goes for a long walk and forgets his bread? Saul didn't smile. There's more. The cafe sits 1 block from an old bakery location, Hardgrove's first. It's been closed for a year, but last week, neighbors reported smelling something burning inside. Wolfe opened his eyes fully. You notified the authorities? Discreetly, Saul said. They're investigating now. Wolfe gave the faintest nod. If he was a man who believed in premonitions, he would have had one right then, but Wolfe didn't believe in premonitions. Only in evidence, preferably delivered with quiet efficiency by Saul Panzer. The call came just after lunch. Sergeant Pearlie Stebbins, who has all the charm of overcooked cabbage but gets results when it matters, phoned to inform us that a body had been discovered in the abandoned bakery location Saul had sniffed out. "Charred," Stebbins said. "Back wall of the kitchen, inside the walk-in oven?" "I'll spare you the details." It wasn't pretty, and the identity was uncertain, until dental records confirmed what Wolfe had already begun to suspect. Graham Hardgrove was dead. The fire hadn't killed him. That much was clear. According to the coroner's initial report, he had ingested a toxic agent, cyanide, most likely, before the fire ever touched him. The body had been placed inside the oven, and the flame lit afterward. It was either a symbolic flourish or a calculated cover-up. Knowing this cast a long shadow across our dining room. Fritz was quiet that evening, his eyes focused on his knife, but his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Wolfe didn't speak during the meal at all. He was thinking, which meant the silence wasn't to be broken lightly. Later in the office, Wolfe finally addressed me without looking up. "Mr. Goodwin, describe the bread you retrieved from the alley again." "Burnt," I said. "Mostly crust, covered in a fine black dust, charcoal maybe, possibly activated." "Clever," Wolfe murmured. "Cyanide leaves a bitter aftertaste. Charcoal masks it. If the bread had been used as the vehicle for the poison, the charcoal could serve dual purpose, delivery and disguise. That's speculative." "That," Wolfe corrected, "is deductive." He paused. "Someone mimicked Hardgrove's method perfectly, enough to deceive even Fritz and myself. Then when the source became inconvenient, he was eliminated, reduced to cinders like a ruined batch, but not before his secret formula was stolen, commodified and published." "And the blog?" "A smokescreen," Wolfe said, "a way to flood the public sphere with the knowledge before it could be traced." "And now?" I asked. "Now," Wolfe said, "we bait the oven." His fingers laced across his chest. The trap was beginning to form, and I knew from long practice, once Wolfe began designing traps, someone was about to get singed. The official autopsy came the next morning. Wolfe had requested a summary via his own informal network, namely Saul's contact at the coroner's office, a man discreet enough to keep breathing. The summary, typed and smudged with coffee rings, sat in Wolfe's lap as he read it aloud. "Cause of death," Wolfe intoned, "potassium cyanide. Estimated ingestion time, 1 to 2 hours prior to immolation. No defensive wounds. Death was immediate or near to it." I leaned on the edge of my desk. "So Graham didn't go down swinging?" "He was not permitted the chance," Wolfe murmured, "and now he is bread dust." Fritz, standing in the doorway, cleared his throat. In his hands, wrapped in a linen towel like a relic, was the burnt crust I'd recovered from the alley. He stepped forward and placed it gently on Wolfe's desk. "I analyzed it," he said softly. "That dust, it's activated charcoal, high grade, the kind used in some detox processes. Or," I added, "to mask bitterness." Like that of cyanide, Wolfe tapped the crust with one finger. "Symbolically precise, murder by means of artifice, cloaked in the medium of one's craft. He was fed the method of his own destruction, quite literally." I whistled. "You think he was poisoned through bread?" "Unquestionably. Bread he either baked or tasted." "Could it have been accidental?" Fritz asked. His voice held something fragile underneath it. Wolfe turned his head slightly, not unkindly. "No, Fritz, it could not." There was a silence then, the kind that settles over a room like flour dust, barely visible, impossible to ignore. The crust on the desk remained unmoving, but somehow it had more to say than any of us. Wolfe rose, yes, rose, from his chair. "The crime," he said, "is now warm enough to proof. Let us continue." Wolfe's theory, like his digestion, was rarely in a rush, but once it began moving, it processed everything. That afternoon, I found him in the office with a yellow pad and the sort of posture that meant he was more dangerous than usual. "The blog," he said without looking up, "was never meant to conceal the crime. It was meant to obscure the timeline." I blinked. "You've lost me." He set the pad aside. If Hardgrove had merely disappeared, suspicion would have eventually fallen on Metna. Their rivalry was public, their quarrels louder than necessary. But by releasing Hardgrove's method under an anonymous blog, the killer reframed the narrative. "Reframed how?" "As homage," Wolfe replied. "An anonymous fan preserving a technique, presenting it as leaked brilliance rather than proprietary theft. It creates ambiguity. Is it theft? Is it tribute? Was it Hardgrove himself, leaving behind a legacy before vanishing?" I grimaced. "That's diabolically clever." "It is also juvenile," Wolfe said, eyes narrowing. "The killer sought to look like an admirer, but admiration does not come with a timestamp and Wi-Fi data pointing directly to a relative. Saul had confirmed the connection between the cafe's IP address and Metna's cousin. Wolfe had underlined it twice on his pad. "And let us not forget," Wolfe said, "that the post appeared after Metna had secured the exclusive millet blend from Hardgrove's supplier, under false credentials." "This is not inspiration. This is orchestration." I leaned back. "So the blog was the magician's flourish, get everyone watching the hand waving the flower, while the other one's holding the match." "Precisely," Wolfe said. "And now that the blog has served its purpose, it has become a liability, the one clue too perfect, too curated. It speaks of guilt by its very neatness." "And the next move?" I asked. Wolfe's lips curled faintly. "We shall let the magician perform one more act in our theatre." And that meant only one thing. He was about to cast the parts for a very final performance. The smell hit me first. I'd returned to the Crust and Crumb under the pretense of ordering their latest seasonal invention, pear rosemary focaccia, but the moment I stepped inside, I caught a scent that didn't belong. It was too nostalgic, too specific. To most, it would smell like bread. To me, and to anyone who had spent time around Wolfe's palate and Fritz's perfectionism, it smelled like Graham Hardgrove. I watched as a young assistant pulled a loaf from the oven behind the counter. The crust sang as it cooled, crackling in a rhythm I'd heard before. The scoring pattern on top matched one I'd seen in a framed photo on Hardgrove's old business card. 2 diagonal cuts intersecting a third curve like a signature in crust. Coincidence? About as likely as Wolfe requesting a street hot dog. I ordered a loaf and, with a charm offensive even I was proud of, managed to get the assistant talking. "Oh, that? Mr. Metna calls it artisan heritage sourdough. Started doing it just last week. Says it's an homage to a lost genius." "Graham Hardgrove?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "Funny thing, though, we've had the shaping guide for months. He was just waiting for the right time to launch it." I tipped him an extra 5 and left with my loaf and a gut full of suspicions. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe didn't need to taste it. He just looked. He held it like a paleontologist examining a fossil, and nodded once. "This was shaped," he said, "by someone who had studied Hardgrove's technique down to the motion of his wrists. It is not copied, it is relived." "And that," I said, "means whoever made this had access to the man, his process, or both." Wolfe grunted. "It was not merely bread, it was memory. And now it is mimicry." And then a pause, a stillness. Wolfe's gaze drifted not to the bread but to the kitchen. Something old was stirring in his mind, and I didn't like the smell of it. The conversation happened in the kitchen, not Wolfe's usual stage for interrogation, but this wasn't the usual kind of witness. Fritz stood by the stove, his back turned to us, slicing herbs with unnecessary precision. Wolfe didn't sit, he stood, which should have been Fritz's first warning. "Fritz," Wolfe said gently, "there's something I must ask you to recall." Fritz didn't turn. "If it's about the salt again, I've reduced it by 3/4 of a gram." "It is not." Wolfe folded his hands behind his back. "Years ago, I arranged for a culinary exchange. A guest, Calvin Mettner, was invited to observe your methods, correct? The slicing slowed. Yes, Fritz said. He was one of 3 chefs who came to study fermentation rhythms. You approved them all. And you walked him through our kitchen? I did. And Graham Hardgrove, was he part of that exchange? No. Fritz finally turned. He refused, said his method wasn't meant to be shared. Wolfe nodded slowly. But Mettner stayed. He asked questions? Yes, not as many as the others, but he watched more closely. And you showed him? I didn't. Fritz faltered. For the first time in the decade I'd known him, his hands trembled. I didn't think. He wasn't important then. He was quiet, polite. I thought it was harmless. Wolfe's face didn't change, but I knew the man well enough to recognize the small twitch in his jaw, a grimace swallowed before it could fully form. I allowed it, he said. Which means I am not merely host to a crime. I am its vector. Don't say that, Fritz said sharply. You didn't know, none of us did. Wolfe turned toward the dining room. He observed, he retained, and when the moment came, he enacted, precisely what he had studied. I permitted a thief into the sanctum, and you, Fritz, gave him a key. The words weren't cruel, but they weighed heavy. Fritz lowered his knife. I'll resign. You will not, Wolfe said, but you will bear this with me. That is penance enough. I stood silent, not because I lacked something to say, but because the air was too full of regret and roasted rosemary. The memory hung there, heavier than smoke. And the case, I knew, had turned personal. Wolfe never hosts unless he means to dominate. That's one of the great constants of life at the Brownstone, along with my expense reports getting less attention than they deserve, and beer being served with the solemnity of a papal blessing. So when I was instructed to invite a list of names to the Brownstone for a culinary consultation, I knew we were entering the endgame, though Wolfe hadn't yet said it outright. The guest list was curated like a recipe, with Wolfe as the chef. Calvin Mettner, of course. Lila Grange, the jittery apprentice from the Crust and Crumb, Mrs. Eloise Hardgrove, the client, equal parts poise and worry, a sharply dressed woman named Veronica Watts, food blogger and minor digital celebrity, whom Wolfe suspected to be behind, or at least adjacent, to Proofed and Poached. And finally, Detective Rowcliffe, who arrived precisely 8 minutes late, presumably to assert authority. The invitations were vague on purpose. Wolfe insisted I word them with the ambiguity of a fortune cookie. Something about collective clarity regarding culinary integrity. That'll get them in the door, I said. That will get them curious, Wolfe replied. And curiosity, Mr. Goodwin, is the only trap one need not bait. Fritz prepared tea and an assortment of mild, inoffensive pastries, Wolfe's way of saying let's keep things civil, without actually caring if it happened. The office chairs were arranged in a semicircle around Wolfe's own. He'd angled his chair just slightly to catch every face in a single turn of his head. I presume, he said before anyone had touched the tea, that you are wondering why I've invited you? He paused. The silence did the rest. No one spoke, but I could practically hear the thoughts fermenting. The oven, so to speak, had been preheated. I'd seen more relaxed standoffs during poker games at the precinct. Mettner sat stiffly, arms crossed, the very image of aggrieved professionalism. Lila Grange looked like he might chew his own thumbnail down to the elbow. Veronica Watts smiled with the confidence of someone whose brand required confidence. Eloise sat quiet, though her hands were tightly clasped in her lap. Rowcliffe, standing near the door, did what Rowcliffe always did, glowered and waited for someone to do something arrestable. Wolfe said nothing. That was the strategy. He let the quiet thicken. I don't mean your average room lull. I mean the kind of silence that makes people look at their shoes and wonder if they've left the oven on. Finally, it was Veronica who broke. I assume you've asked us here about Graham Hardgrove. Wolfe didn't nod. He simply stared. She continued, her tone adjusting by half a degree. There's been a lot of speculation, she said. Missing persons always stir that up, especially when the person's as eccentric as Graham was. Metna scoffed. He was unstable. You all knew it. Eloise's lips tightened. Wolfe finally spoke. And yet, he said, he baked better than you. That one landed. Metna flushed. Rowcliffe's eyebrow twitched. I stayed still, cataloguing the reactions like I was inventorying an armory. Lila's leg was bouncing. Veronica suddenly found her teacup interesting. Eloise shifted her gaze from Wolfe to Metna and back again. Wolfe leaned forward just enough to make the room feel smaller. Each of you knows something, he said. Not enough, perhaps, to understand the full loaf, but each has handled a slice. He turned his head slowly toward Metna. I intend, he said, to reassemble it. The tension climbed one notch further, and as I scanned the faces, I couldn't help but think, someone in that room was already sweating the crust. Wolfe turned his head ever so slightly toward me. That was the signal. It didn't come with a wink or a nudge, just a glacial tilt that meant, kindly begin dismantling the suspect. I obliged. Mr. Metna, I said, smiling, with exactly the amount of warmth you'd use on a cold biscuit. You mentioned earlier that you hadn't seen or spoken to Graham Hardgrove for nearly 2 months prior to his disappearance, correct? I did, he said curtly. And during that time you were, let's say, preoccupied, developing your new bread line. The one inspired by the late Mr. Hardgrove. Inspired is a generous term, Veronica murmured. Metna shot her a look and returned to me. I've said what I've said. Sure, but I'm curious, where were you on the 14th of this month? He blinked. Working? At the bakery? Yes. All day? Of course. I pulled a small folded sheet from my breast pocket, straightened it, and handed it to Wolfe, who didn't bother reading it aloud. This, he said, is a manifest from Exalted Grains, your supplier. It shows a delivery was made to your bakery at 11:42 a.m. that day. Metna nodded, too quickly. Yes, that was for the rye batch. Odd, I said, because that manifest lists a single grain, Hardgrove's exclusive toasted millet blend. The room inhaled as one. I ordered that weeks ago, Metna said quickly. It was back-ordered. No, Wolfe said flatly. You ordered it under a fictitious business name. Your cousin Warren Metna made the payment. Your bakery address was listed as the recipient, but you failed to mention the order to your staff, nor did you log it in your weekly inventory. Curious omissions, no? Metna opened his mouth and then closed it. Also curious, I added, is that the camera at the back of your store was disconnected for precisely 48 minutes that day, beginning at 11:30 a.m. Veronica let out a low whistle. Lila's knee resumed its nervous jig. That's a lot of sourdough secrecy, I said, for a guy who claims he's just paying tribute. Metna crossed his arms, but the veneer was cracking, and from the corner of the room, Wolfe's voice dropped to a silken hush. The truth, like yeast, will rise. If guilt had a smell, Lila Grange was marinating in it. He'd been fidgeting since the moment we mentioned the manifest, but now his hands were visibly trembling. I watched him like you'd watch a cracked wine glass, knowing the wrong word might shatter the whole thing. Wolfe, never one to miss an opening, turned to him slowly. Mr. Grange, would you care to contribute? Lila swallowed. I wasn't part of anything, I just worked the early shift. Which included cleaning the prep room, I said. And storage. He nodded. Yes, I saw the bag, the millet flour. It had Hardgrove's supplier code on it. I thought maybe they changed vendors. And you didn't ask, Wolfe said. Not a question. I didn't think it was my place. But it was your place, I said. When you walked into the backlot 2 nights later and saw your boss tossing something into the dumpster and lighting it on fire. That got everyone's attention. Even Rowcliffe, who'd been perfecting his statue impression in the corner, straightened. I didn't mean to spy, Lila stammered. I was going back for my phone. I'd left it in the staff locker. When I came out, he was crouched over the bin. There were papers, a bag of something, I think it was receipts. He lit them and walked off. "Did he see you?" Wolfe asked. Number the boy ducked behind the delivery crates. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to lose my job. And you didn't mention this to the police? I wasn't sure it mattered. It always matters, Wolfe said. Mettner said nothing. He was staring straight ahead, jaw rigid. The room had shifted. Lila's voice dropped. I think he knew I saw him. He's been different since then. Different how? I asked. Quiet, watchful, like he was waiting for something. Or someone. Wolfe's gaze flicked to me. No words, just the faintest hint of a nod. One ingredient had cracked. The rest would follow. When Saul Panzer walks into a room during a confrontation, it usually means someone's about to get gently flattened by the weight of well-researched facts. He entered the office without a word, handed Wolfe a folded sheet, and stepped aside like the ghost of due diligence. Wolfe skimmed it, then passed it to me without comment. At the top, Hoy's lookup, proofed and poached.blog. Below that, a trail of domain masking, privacy protection layers, and finally, the unraveling of the whole thing by a slip in one of the IP logs. A coffee shop connection led to a local IP, and from there to a laptop registered to Warren Mettner, Calvin's cousin, occasional tech contractor, and, according to Saul's quiet digging, recent recipient of an unexplained $5,000 wire transfer. I let out a low whistle and glanced up at Calvin, who had managed to look increasingly guilty while trying not to move. Wolfe addressed the room. The blog, he said, was designed to appear spontaneous, an admirer's nod to a lost genius, but technology, unlike flour, leaves fingerprints. Veronica tilted her head. So it was a cover? Precisely, Wolfe said. The digital breadcrumbs lead to Mr. Warren Mettner, who posted the content from a cafe 1 block from the location where Graham Hardgrove's body was later found. That post was crafted using language unique to Hardgrove's writing, a fact confirmed by Miss Watts, who once edited his newsletter. Veronica raised a brow. I thought it sounded familiar. Wolfe continued. The source material for the post was not copied. It was lifted entirely, which means access, personal access, physical access. Mettner opened his mouth, but no words emerged. Furthermore, I said, stepping in for the coup de grace, the payment from your account to your cousins was conveniently listed as consulting fees. That's one expensive homage. Rowcliffe cleared his throat, but Wolfe lifted a hand. Not yet. Wolfe's eyes returned to Mettner. Mr. Mettner, there is a difference between borrowing inspiration and stealing legacy. One flatters, the other burns. Mettner looked at the floor. The silence in the room had teeth now, and Wolfe, ever the strategist, wasn't quite done sharpening them. Wolfe sat back, steepling his fingers. The room had ripened, tense, suspicious, and just shy of boiling. Perfect for baking confessions. I find, Wolfe said, that memory is the true enemy of the criminal, not law, not justice, but memory, especially when it's faulty. He turned to me. Mr. Goodwin, would you kindly inform each guest, separately, of a specific detail regarding the crime scene? Something small, a fragment. It wasn't the first time Wolfe had used misdirection, but this was subtler than most. I nodded and moved to each guest in turn, murmuring a different recent discovery in confidence. To Veronica Watts. They found a broken measuring scale beside the oven. To Lila Grange, there was a torn apron still smeared with millet dough. To Calvin Mettner. The fire suppression system was disabled before the blaze, deliberately. Each one nodded gravely, surprised or confused, but said little. Wolfe gave it time. He watched their faces with a botanist's detachment, waiting for blooms. Then he asked a simple question to the group. Can any of you describe what the oven looked like, specifically its layout? There was a pause. Then Mettner, betraying himself with the eagerness of a child who'd studied the wrong chapter, spoke. It was a standard commercial model, iron handle, double door, left hinge. Wolfe's eyes gleamed. No, he said. Metner froze. The oven at Hardgrove's original bakery was custom. Right hinge, single door, no iron handle, wooden. Designed by the baker himself, that detail was never released, not in the papers, not in the police report. I folded my arms. So how would you know? The room snapped to Metner. He opened his mouth, then shut it. I must have, I assumed. He stammered. No, Wolfe said. You remembered. Veronica gasped. Rowcliffe stepped forward. Metner tried to stand. You can't prove. No one needs to, Wolfe said. The weight of your own knowledge has done it. You remembered the oven because you saw it. The night you killed him. Rowcliffe moved in. That's enough. Wolfe waved a hand dismissively. Take him. Metner didn't resist. He simply sat, shoulders collapsing inward, like a souffle forgotten in an open door. Wolfe, satisfied, closed his eyes. Well, that is the end of that crust. But I knew from experience we still had one final course. Wolfe doesn't rush his victories. He lets them ferment, slow, measured, and exact. And if he senses that a suspect hasn't yet sealed their own fate, he'll prod them just enough to let the dough collapse under its own weight. Metner had gone quiet again, hoping silence might reverse the damage. It never does. Wolfe turned to me with the faintest curl of the finger. Another signal. This one meant, now you finish him off. I gave a casual shrug and said, Funny thing, though, when I visited that oven, after the fire, I noticed something. The lower tray, the one that slid out from the bottom rack, was warped on the left edge, bent slightly upward, like it had caught too much heat. That was the bait. And Metner, not content with drowning, chose to swim deeper. That tray was always like that, he said quickly. Graham used it for steam baking. He'd pour water in to boost the humidity. The room went still. Wolfe didn't move. Rowcliffe leaned in. Eloise gasped audibly. I looked at Wolfe. Wolfe looked at Metner. Curious, Wolfe said mildly. That detail, too, was not public. Not in the fire report. Not in the coroner's statement. Not in any known recipe. How would you know that, Mr. Metner? Metner licked his lips. I saw it when I visited him years ago. Years ago, Wolfe echoed. Yet you remember a warped tray, its function, the precise behavior of steam baking? I have a good memory. No, Wolfe said, voice now sharp as a bread knife. You have guilt, guilt that clings like flour to the cuffs. You knew that tray was warped because you touched it, because you pulled it out to place the poisoned loaf inside. Rowcliffe stepped forward. Metner's hands twitched. You can't. There's no proof. You provided the proof, Wolfe said, when you corrected a detail you were never given. The warped tray burned Graham Hardgrove. Now it burns you. Metner collapsed into his chair, his silence now less strategy and more surrender. Rowcliffe moved in with his usual lack of flair, but I'll give him this. When he snapped the cuffs on, the finality of the click was better than any gavel. And Wolfe? He simply closed his eyes, like the baker he was never willing to become, satisfied that the rise had ended exactly where it should. When Wolfe decides to deliver judgment, he does so from his chair as if it were a throne, and the rest of us, suspects, observers, and the occasional unfortunate lawman, are the gallery. No robes, no gavels, just silence, intellect, and the occasional glance that could bake dough. The room had emptied after Rowcliffe carted Metner off for holding, but Wolfe, never content to resolve without clarity, requested the others remain. Eloise Hardgrove, Veronica Watts, Lila Grange, Saul in the corner, arms folded, and me, of course, because every symphony needs someone to turn the pages. Fritz brought in Wolfe's beer and my coffee without a word, then retreated, quiet, but not quite composed. Wolfe took a long, deliberate sip of his beer, then placed the glass down as though it had something to confess. There is, he said, a satisfaction in the completion of an elegant sequence, but satisfaction is not justice, it is only clarity. And clarity, ladies and gentlemen, is what we now possess. No one spoke. Even Veronica, whose online presence was calibrated for perpetual commentary, found her tongue in neutral. Eloise sat with her hands folded tightly, not out of etiquette, but necessity. Wolfe glanced at me. I met his eye and gave the barest nod. That was all he needed. "I will now state, without embellishment or rhetorical indulgence," Wolfe continued, "that Calvin Mettner is the murderer of Graham Hardgrove." A sharp intake of breath from Eloise. Lila closed his eyes. "He stole not only a recipe," Wolfe said, "but a man's identity, his craftsmanship, and ultimately his life." Veronica swallowed hard. "But why? Why go that far?" Wolfe leaned forward ever so slightly, fingers pressed together. "Because Graham Hardgrove humiliated him, and humiliation," he said, "is the yeast of vengeance." "Calvin Mettner," Wolfe began, "was a competent baker, not inspired, not original, but proficient. He had, as Mr. Goodwin once put it, a crust without soul." "Thank you," I said. He coveted not merely Graham Hardgrove's method, but the reverence with which it was received. He saw in Hardgrove a man who had not only mastered the art, but had done so without compromise, without pandering, and that made him dangerous to men like Mettner, who rely on the appearance of mastery more than its substance. Eloise spoke, finally, her voice low and steady. "But Graham never sought fame. He wasn't even good with people." "All the more reason," Wolfe replied, "that his excellence cut deeper. It came without theatre. Mettner sued him once, you may recall. A public debacle. He lost. The court confirmed Hardgrove's formula was his alone. That loss," Wolfe paused, "stewed." Veronica tilted her head. "So Mettner waited?" "Indeed," Wolfe said. "He waited until the moment he believed he could erase the source and inherit the substance. He obtained the grain, reconstructed the technique, likely through Fritz's original demonstration years ago, and built a product designed not only to replicate, but to supplant. And when Hardgrove threatened to expose him, Mettner acted." "He didn't just want the bread," I said. "He wanted the brand." Wolfe nodded. "He poisoned Hardgrove with cyanide, masked by activated charcoal in the crust, and disposed of him in the very oven where his legacy was built. Symbolic, clean, clinical, arrogant," Lila whispered. "He said he was launching a tribute." "A convenient euphemism," Wolfe said coldly. "He burned the body and published the recipe." Veronica sat back, stunned. "That's monstrous." "Yes," Wolfe said, "but well leavened. It rose precisely as he intended, until, of course, the tray betrayed him. And with that, Wolfe reached again for his beer. Not a grand finale, no flourish, no gavel, but a closure of sorts. The kind only he could serve cold, with a bitter note and perfect balance. Wolfe adjusted the crease of his trousers with the care of a man who believes order must be restored in all things, fabric, food, and felonies. "There is elegance," he said, "in the method. A terrible, perverted elegance, but elegance nonetheless. Mr. Mettner chose not to assault Graham Hardgrove's body, but his craft. He didn't kill the man, he erased the origin." He lifted his glass of beer, but didn't sip. "Let us review the components of the recipe, shall we?" No one objected. Eloise sat, stone still, lips pressed together. Veronica had gone pale but fascinated. Saul, silent as always, made no movement, only watched. 1. Motive, humiliation, envy, professional rejection. The base ingredients, Wolfe said. 2. Access. Mettner had once toured our kitchen years ago, courtesy of Fritz, and had absorbed enough of Hardgrove's habits to reconstruct his method. But method alone does not make bread. It requires signature. Which he stole, I said. Grain, shaping, crust scoring, all of it. Precisely, Wolfe replied. He obtained the signature millet blend from Hardgrove's supplier under a false business name, then used the stolen proportions to recreate a nearly indistinguishable loaf, only slightly altered to appear unique. He probably tested it, I added. Perfected it, using the old kitchen to hide the trials. And once it was perfected, Wolfe said, he moved on to the final stage, the discard. Veronica whispered, "You mean the murder?" Wolfe inclined his head. He laced the bread with potassium cyanide, a fast-acting and bitter compound. To mask the taste, he incorporated activated charcoal into the crust, subtle, earthy, fashionable among certain culinary trends. The charcoal would not only dull the bitterness, but provide visual camouflage for the crust's dark hue. "And then the fire," I said. "Yes," Wolfe agreed. The body, placed in the same oven where the recipe was perfected, was incinerated, both as symbol and smokescreen. Lila looked queasy. He destroyed Graham's body using the very thing Graham loved most, an oven and a recipe. The act wasn't just murder. It was a culinary forgery, a perversion of art into violence. I said nothing, because for once I had nothing sharp to add. Sometimes Wolfe doesn't just solve a case, he clarifies it so completely you feel embarrassed for having called it a mystery in the first place. And as he resumed sipping his beer, I realized we weren't quite finished, not until he told us how this recipe started. Wolfe set his glass down and reached for the smallest item on his desk, still wrapped in its original cloth. The charred heel of bread I'd pulled from the alley behind Hardgrove's shuttered bakery. "It began here," he said. "Not with theft, but with insult." I raised a brow. "You mean the starter?" "Indeed," Wolfe said. "Fritz's sourdough, flat, lifeless, offensively dull. At first, we believed it to be a culinary misstep, but Fritz noticed a metallic tang, a subtle alteration." "I remember," I said. "He thought someone had tampered with his starter." "They had," Wolfe replied. "With the same charcoal metana used in the poisoned loaf. It's a remarkable substance, porous, lightweight, and highly absorbent. A pinch could ruin fermentation without obvious visual evidence." Veronica asked, "But why sabotage Fritz's starter?" "To test the medium," Wolfe answered. The sabotage was a dry run, a way to determine whether the charcoal mixture would corrupt a living culture without raising suspicion, and it did. Fritz, standing at the doorway now, spoke quietly. "That's why the texture collapsed." "Yes," Wolfe said. Metner, uncertain whether his method of delivery would pass undetected, chose the safest test, a competitor's kitchen with no risk of accusation. He had been here before, he knew the layout, and he slipped in unnoticed. "That's insane," Lila muttered. "No," Wolfe said. "It was calculated. The test yielded results. Once confirmed, he adjusted the dose, prepared the poisoned loaf, and ensured it would be consumed." "But Graham didn't die right away," I said. "Correct," Wolfe said. "He likely tasted the bread before delivering it. Bakers do. The dose was enough." The charcoal concealed the bitterness. The fire obscured the evidence. All that remained was a heel of bread and a corrupted starter. "And now," I said, "the starter's clean?" "The kitchen's clean, but he left behind ashes." Wolfe gave me a rare glance of approval. "Yes, and like any proper ashes, they have been sifted." He leaned back and folded his hands across his considerable chest. Graham Hardgrove's legacy was not erased. It was revealed, bitter, burnt, and finally whole. In that moment, even the air stood still. The truth, as Wolfe liked it, had risen. Wolfe had barely finished his closing line when Calvin Metner, who'd been sitting motionless in the red chair, abruptly stood up. It wasn't dramatic, no shout of denial or chest-pounding speech. Just a quick rise, a twitch at the jaw, and a glance toward the front door that was a beat too long to be innocent. Unfortunately for him, Rowcliffe was faster than he looked. "Don't," Rowcliffe said, already stepping into the gap between Metner and the hallway. "I'm in no mood for amateur choreography." Metner froze, his weight shifting indecisively between both feet. "You don't have any physical evidence," he said, eyes darting toward Wolfe like a man hoping for a final reprieve from a judge who no longer sits on the bench. "We have motive, method, opportunity, and the betraying arrogance of one who tried too hard to be clever," Wolfe replied without looking up. "You provided the rope. I simply held it." Rowcliffe reached into his coat and removed the cuffs, polished and impersonal. "I've got enough to hold you for obstruction, if nothing else," he said. And with your cousin already spilling to the DA, I'd say your alibi is about to fall apart like a 3-day sponge cake. You don't understand, Metner said hoarsely. He had everything. I had nothing. Wolfe sighed. And now you have less than that. The cuffs clicked into place. Metner flinched at the sound more than the steel. Rowcliffe guided him firmly toward the door. Veronica sat, stunned. Lila looked ready to faint. And Eloise just stared at the empty chair where her brother's killer had sat. As the door shut behind them, Wolfe exhaled and muttered, "Finally!" I took a deep breath, feeling the tension uncoil. "Well, that's one loaf that won't rise again," Wolfe winced. "Must you?" "Occupational hazard," I said. But truth be told, even I didn't feel like quipping. Not after this one. The silence that followed Rowcliffe's exit wasn't victory. It was wait. Eloise, seated upright just minutes before, now slumped forward slightly, eyes red and brimming. She didn't wail or sob. She simply breathed like someone relearning how. Fritz, who had watched everything from the doorway without a sound, stepped forward just long enough to place a linen napkin on the desk, still folded. Then, without a word or glance, turned and walked out toward the kitchen. I made a move to follow him, but stopped. Some silences aren't meant to be interrupted. Some wounds need solitude more than sympathy. Eloise finally looked up at Wolfe. "Thank you," she whispered. He wasn't easy, but he deserved better than that." Wolfe gave a solemn nod. He did. And that was all he said. Because in Wolfe's world, clarity had already done what comfort never could. We returned to normal the way Wolfe always did, not with celebration, but with ceremony. That evening, precisely at 6:45, I entered the dining room with one bottle, chilled, properly poured, head-foamed just so, and set it beside him with the solemnity of a sacrament. He said nothing, which was how I knew he approved. I took my seat, poured my own drink, 1 part gin, 3 parts relief, and leaned back. Wolfe raised his glass, took a measured sip, and then, eyes still closed, said, "Let them have cake, I'll have bread." I didn't respond. No quip, no sarcasm, not even a raised brow. Instead, I just lifted my martini and let the silence say it for me. Because every once in a while, even I know when the last word doesn't belong to me. 2 days later, things had settled into their usual rhythm at the brownstone. Wolfe had resumed his orchid schedule, Saul had gone on to chase someone else's secrets, and Fritz had returned to the kitchen with the caution of a man testing the air after a storm. That evening, Fritz served a rustic sourdough, nothing fancy, nothing declared. Just a golden loaf with a sharp crackle when he sliced it. He said nothing as he placed the basket between Wolfe and me. But he did look at Wolfe, just for a fraction of a second, like a man hoping for forgiveness, but not asking for it. Wolfe picked up a slice, examined the crumb, took a bite. He chewed, swallowed, then said, "Acceptable, that's all. Not extraordinary, not revelatory, not poetic, just one word, delivered without sarcasm or sting." Fritz inclined his head, the barest gesture, and turned back toward the kitchen. But I caught it, the way his shoulders relaxed by a hair, the way his knife sliced a little cleaner. That one word, from Wolfe, was worth more than applause. He finished the slice, reached for another, and said nothing more. But I saw the corners of his mouth. They weren't quite a smile, but they leaned that way. It wasn't peace, exactly, but it was bread. Cases don't always wrap up with a ribbon. Sometimes they close like a box you're not quite sure you want to open again. This one had all the ingredients: motive, misdirection, a slow proof of guilt, but it had something else too, something heavier. Call it remorse, or maybe just the smell of something good, scorched beyond repair. Fritz was back to baking, sure, but his silences still lingered a bit longer in the kitchen. Wolfe had solved the case, dismantled a murderer, and restored order to the world, as usual, but even he seemed to speak less after that final confrontation. As for me, Well, I did what I always do. I wrote up my notes, I filed my reports, I made sure Wolfe's beer came precisely at the right moment. And I watched the man lean back in his chair, steeple his fingers, and say nothing at all. That, more than anything, told me how much the case had mattered. Because this wasn't just a theft or a killing, it was a betrayal of craft, of creation, of something Wolfe holds sacred, even if he'd never admit it over roast duck. Bread, after all, isn't just food to him. It's the one thing he'll let speak for itself. Even I know when to shut up and listen. We were sitting in the dining room, just the two of us. Fritz had retreated, the table was cleared, and Wolfe was finishing his final bite of the crust. Then, almost as an afterthought, he looked up at me and said, "Let them have cake." I raised an eyebrow. "You're quoting Marie Antoinette now?" "No," he said, wiping his fingers with care. "I'm correcting her." He leaned back and closed his eyes. "Cake is indulgent. Bread is earned. And justice," he added, "should be like bread." "Served fresh daily?" I offered. He didn't open his eyes. "Served warm, honest, with no sugar to hide the taste." There was nothing left to argue, no clever comeback. Just Wolfe, silent again. I nodded. Bread it is. Later that night, I poured myself a martini and stood by the office window, watching the city lights blink like slow thoughts. The case was over, the killer caught, and the bread, for once, not a metaphor, but a memorial. I raised the glass and gave it a small, solitary toast. "To truth," I said, "to crusts that don't lie, and to Wolfe, who never needs to rise because he's already sitting too high for the rest of us to reach." I took a sip, dry, clean, no garnish, felt about right. Behind me, I heard Wolfe shift in his chair. Not speak, just move, which from him was practically applause. I smiled to myself and turned out the light, because some endings don't need fanfare, just good bread, and maybe a splash of gin.